Howdy folks, thanks for stopping in at Dad's Toolbox. In today's video we're going to build a rabbit tractor. Alright, so the first obvious step when you're doing a project is to get your materials together. I use scrap wood from previous projects like some 2x4s that I resawed on the table saw. I just split them down the middle. They're basically 1x4s now. And then I also used some reclaimed fence planks and runners. Part of my fence blew down during a storm, and after I repaired it, I kept all of the wood so I could salvage what I could out of it. When I designed the project, I chose half-lap and glue construction because a glue joint's way stronger than when you just use fasteners. And also the wood was so dry I was worried that it would split when I ran screws through it. I figured half-laps would make the structure lighter too, because you're going to be, when you create a half-lap, you're dadoing out a bunch of wood. When you're losing wood, you're losing weight, right? So half-laps also reduce racking by making it so that when the joint tries to shift, it spreads that force down a much longer axis rather than focusing all of the force on the narrow point of contact provided by the fasteners. Now, for those who aren't sure what racking is, think about when you sit down on an old stool and how it'll shift and wobble side to side. That's because the joints are actually twisting, and that twisting is referred to as racking. I was really concerned about the weight because I wanted the structure to be light enough for my wife and either of my children to go ahead and move it without assistance. That way the rabbits could be maintained even if I was out of town or whatnot. I was aiming for a 2-foot by 4-foot footprint so that I could use a single sheet of plywood to make the lids for the two tractors. Yeah, there was a few things I did buy for that, and one of them was plywood, but I bought a specific kind of plywood because it was light. And after I cut my boards to the length I needed, I used and abused my poor router to cut the dados for the half laps. I had an old flush cut straight bit that the bearing was worn out on, so I took the bearing off of it, strapped it into my router, and used it just to hog all the material out as quickly and efficiently as I could. That way I'm not spending a bunch of time trying to cut all these by hand. So once the dados were cut, I built the corners by attaching my previously dadoed fence planks to some 1.5 by 1.5 stock that I'd cut from the runners in the fence. In order to construct those, I just ran some glue down there and then got it all lined up, and I used the nail gun to go ahead and hold those things in place. I used the nail gun not so much for structural support or anything, but just to hold the pieces together while everything cures up. And the nails, I'm sure they add some kind of structural benefit. As far as the glue goes, I chose Titebond 3 because it's waterproof. Once it cures, it's waterproof and it's rated for outdoor use. You know, if you didn't want to use glue or anything like that, you could easily use screws or nails that you would drive with a hammer. You don't necessarily need the glue and the screw gun. If you do use the screws, though, you're probably going to want to pre-drill your holes so that you don't split your wood. And then, if you decide, or you've been thinking about getting a nail gun, the kit I bought at Home Depot. It was Porter Cable. It was on sale for $150, and I don't remember exactly when I picked it up. But what I have noticed is if you're patient and you check back pretty regularly, you can find stuff like that on sale. Stuff like this usually goes on sale for Christmas and for Father's Day. You know, the big kits that they want to market to families to buy for their fathers. So anyway, back to the rabbit tractor. Once the corner pieces were finished, I went ahead and attached the horizontal pieces to them. And this basically made the ends of the tractor. Once the ends were put together, I went ahead and attached them using the long horizontal rails. And this basically made the whole outer frame of the tractor. You'll notice that the top rail is narrower than the bottom rail, and that's because I wanted the tractor to be bottom heavy. That way it's not knocked over so easy. I don't have to worry about the wind. And also because the lifting system I designed is all the way down at the ground, which also means that if it were to have more weight up high, it could also become unstable that way. Now the thing about using reclaimed material is you kind of get what you got, right? So I had to sift through my stack and find some boards with a long enough section that was straight that I could cut out of them. So during the summer it gets pretty hot and that sun's pretty brutal, so I wanted the back half of the tractor to provide shade for the rabbits. So what I did was I cut down some of those fence planks and attached them to the inside of the frame. The idea was that they would block the sun, but I also spaced them out enough that the air could move through there and get the heat and whatever out of there. That way they're not just sitting in an oven. The fence planks I was using, they were all cupped pretty bad. So what I did was I turned them with the hollow side facing out and attached them to the rails with a nail gun. I skipped the glue on this because, if you're going to use glue, you're going to want a large flat surface, to really bond. If I tried to glue those planks, it would have just been these two tiny little points of contact there where the edges touch the rails. So a couple nails on top, couple nails on bottom, and I drove on. Before I attached the last plank on each side, I started the chicken wire. Once I started the chicken wire, I attached the last plank on the first side, and I used it to sandwich the chicken wire between the plank and the rails so that it would be really secure. I wouldn't have to worry about it getting snagged or anything like that, and also so that the rabbits couldn't find a way to, force their way between the wire and the plank. I used the pneumatic staple gun that came in the kit I mentioned earlier, but a mechanical staple gun, or even some, you can get some staples that you can drive with a hammer, and that'll work just fine. I attached the chicken wire to the inside of the tractor. The idea being, if we're going to roll this thing around the yard, I didn't want it snagging on things and trying to pull out. I was really trying to use the outer frame to protect that wire, because that chicken wire, it's really snaggy, and it just really starts to look horrible after you've stretched it a couple times in the wrong direction. So I ran that chicken wire all the way around, and then where I wanted to end it, I cut it, and then I used that last plank on the second side to sandwich the chicken wire between the plank and the rails, just like I did on the first side. Once that was all done, I pulled all the chicken wire tight, and then I used a staple gun, and I stapled the chicken wire to the planks, usually right there where the wires would intersect. That way you could get two wires at the same time. And then once I got all those shot down, I folded the sharp pointed ends back, and then I used that staple gun to staple those down so that I didn't have to worry about the kids, because they like to play with the rabbits and whatnot. I didn't want them over there getting all cut up by that chicken wire. So I got to looking at this thing after I put most of it together, and I wasn't real happy with the way the planks were attached to the rails. So what I did was I went ahead and I added screws, one on each end of the plank, and screwed it into the rail just to make sure that it wouldn't pull out, because those little 18 gauge nails or 16 gauge nails, they don't grip that well, and stuff like that can easily pull out or be pushed in from the outside. And really the only predators I have to concern myself about would be stray cats or birds. We do have some birds of prey out here, and that's why we're having a lid on it. I just didn't want anything to be able to push those boards in. For the top, I used what Home Depot lists as underlayment board, which is really just a thin, light, low-grade plywood. It was like 3/16 or a 1/4 inch thick, and it's really light and it's inexpensive. Really perfect for what we're doing out here, because we're not trying to build the Taj Mahal. I took the plywood and I laid it on top of the frame, and I lined it up on the three sides, and then just took my pencil and scribed the fourth side from underneath. And then I flipped it over and just cut down that line. Really super simple. So to add structure to the lid, because that thin plywood, it's real floppy and light, wouldn't have been very structurally stable. I glued and stapled some 1x2 strips around the edges, and that made it nice and stiff, and it worked like an actual door. So pro tip here, when you're trying to do something like what I'm doing here, trying to get everything all lined up, and you got glue drying and everything else, it's much easier if you take some clamps and you clamp the first end where you want it, and then you go and you work on the second end and you get it lined up and you clamp it, and then you go back and double check your other end. But then that sucker stays right in place, and then you can just bang them in real quick with a nail gun, and then move those clamps out of your way to finish it off. It's way better than struggling with trying to balance 3-4 pieces at the same time as you're dealing with wet glue and all that good stuff. So while the glue was drying on the lid, I set it off to the side and I started on the handle lift system. I had some half-inch electrical conduit that was laying around that I used earlier in the year when I redid the exterior lighting on the outside of my garage area there. And I know not all folks have the tools you need to bend conduit and whatnot, or even to cut it for that matter, but I was using what I had on hand to limit my out-of-pocket costs. And the conduit, it's strong enough for this application, but you know, if we're being honest, you can bend it or kink it real easy if you try to force it to do something, you know, extreme. If I were to do it again, I'd likely use wood for this portion. The wood's easier to work with and it's stronger, I think. And I would probably use something like something that's 1.5 inches square, probably about like what you would think a wheelbarrow handle would be, you know, something in that realm. And I would use that to make the horizontal portion, and then the little riser that comes up to the handle. And then for the handle, I'd probably use like I don't know, some 1.25 inch closet rod, because that seemed like it would work pretty good. Anyway, I flattened one side of the pipe with my hammer, mostly so that I could get the drill to bite where I needed to drill the holes. Since I was planning to run screws all the way through the pipe, I needed to pre-drill the holes. For the wheels, I'd taken some training wheels off my son's bike recently, and they were still laying there on my workbench. So I just went ahead and took and salvaged those bad boys. And if you don't have any of those training wheels laying around or anything like that, you can pick these. In fact, they're even heavier duty than these training wheels. I've seen them at Tractor Supply and I believe Harbor Freight. I think you got to buy the hardware to mount them, but the wheels are pretty inexpensive. After looking at this thing, I decided the best way to do it would be to cut the training wheel brackets down so that I could attach the brackets to the pipe. The bolt that holds the wheel to the bracket, it's kind of specialized. It's got a smooth area that comes into contact with the wheel there, so it doesn't cut the wheel up. But also they were too short to get all the way through the pipe, so I just cut the brackets and strapped them right there to the side of the pipe. In order to do that, I had to drill some holes in the brackets so that when I ran my sheet metal screws through there, I wouldn't be trying to fight the bracket and the pipe at the same time. I buy these sheet metal screws like this in bulk because it's way cheaper per screw to do that. And then it's nice having them laying around because you can fix darn near anything with them. Now the design I had in mind incorporated an arm that when lifted would apply downward pressure to the wheels, which would in turn lift up the front end of the tractor when the handle was lifted, kind of like a pry bar. And then there would be a stop on the back of the tractor that would cause the back end to lift when the arms were lifted high enough that they come into contact with the stopper that you put in there. Since this was my first go at this, I really kind of had to guess where to place the fulcrum from my lifting mechanism. What I learned is that the further past the fulcrum that you place the wheels, the higher it would lift the front end when the fulcrum was placed right at the end of the tractor. Now, depending on your terrain, you may want to lift the front end up higher than other folks might, but you also have to consider that the higher you lift it, the greater the chance your rabbit might be able to get out. You know, and when you go to lift it, they generally they get a little nervous when you move them, so they might try and get out. On the flip side, though, if you don't lift it high enough, the front edge of the tractor is going to get caught on anything you're trying to traverse over, you know, like rocks. I've got this big tufty grass out here, so big tufts of grass, you know, there'll be obstacles. Or even, you know, your kids, they leave toys laying around. You know, whatever it is you might be trying to drive over. So once you're happy with how high you're lifting the front end, make sure that when you go to attach the fulcrum of the lifting mechanism to the frame, make sure that it's in a nice meaty spot that will carry the weight. You don't want to screw it into like a piece of trim or something and then have that sucker pop out on you when you're trying to move things around. So after I fussed with it for a little bit, I realized my initial plan of using the sheet metal screws to attach the brackets to the pipe didn't work out so well. So what I did was I just went ahead and I drilled all the way through the pipe, and I used some machine screws with nuts and washers to just go ahead and make a really solid attachment. When it came time to attach the two halves of the handle together, I had some 3/4 inch conduit laying around, so I just cut a little section of that, and 1/2 inch conduit will sleeve inside of 3/4 inch conduit, pretty, with room to spare. But instead of trying to use a coupling or anything like that, this 3/4 inch piece of pipe was perfect. I used a spring-loaded center punch to knock a little divot in the pipe there, because I didn't want to flatten it. That would make it harder to put the 1/2 inch pipe inside of it. So I used my center punch to put the little divot in there and use that divot to get the screws started, using those sheet metal screws I described earlier. Another issue I ran into with the handle was I realized that as I lifted it and would wheel it around, I was lifting it really high. I realized that, my wife's like a foot shorter than I am, and then I got kids that are 2 and 3 feet shorter than she is, so I bent that handle back away from the tractor to try and lower it, and also make it so that you could walk. With that handle at such an acute angle there, once you lifted it, you would be walking and banging your shins on the end of the tractor, and that sucked. So once I got those mechanics worked out, what I did was I determined how far I needed to lift the handle to get the lift height I wanted on the front end. And then once that was determined right there, all I did was mark it, and that's where I installed, I had some heavy gauge screws. I think they were like 8 gauge screws. Something that's going to be able to withstand the weight, the shear force you're putting on them there. And I just screwed those in on those marks. I made sure that they matched on both sides. That way you're not lifting one corner higher than the other. So when you lift it, the wheels push the front end up, and then the back part of that arm grabs the back end of the tractor, and you pick it up. And, it's only a couple inches off the ground, and you can just motor around wherever you need to. Once I was happy with the mobility of the tractor and how easy it was to move around, I went and got that lid, and I put some hinges on the bottom side of the lid. And then my daughter just happened to come around, and I recruited her to help me line the lid up while I attached it to the frame. So once I get this lid on there, I realized that you either have to hold the thing open and do your work with one hand, or you had to open the lid all the way and flop it over to the other side. And I didn't like that a whole lot. So I kind of weighed the idea of making a little prop that you could prop it open with and everything. And I didn't like the prop idea because that leaves the lid partially closed and it gives you less room. So what I came up with was I was going to use a strap. I had this nylon strap material from another project that was laying around, and I had plenty of it. So in order to attach it to the lid, I took my drill and I just drilled a series of holes, basically a slot right there at the right around the center front edge of the lid, right up against the trim. And then I fed the strap into the hole from the top so that I could wrap it around to the bottom of the lid right there in that trim, where that trim was attached. And then I used a screw and a washer. The idea with the washer is so that the screw doesn't pull through the strap, and it would sit nice and flush. And then I opened it up, and I got it set to where it would hold itself open, and you could do your work in there without having to worry about the lid closing on your head. And went ahead and cut the strap, the other end of the strap right there where it would attach to the wood. Now, when you cut a nylon strap, don't forget to melt the end so that it doesn't fray and fall apart on you. Once my strap was cut and melted, I wrapped it over the top rail and fed it through the chicken wire so that I could attach it to the inside of the rail. I did it this way so that the strap, when the door was closed, would remain on the outside of the tractor, because rabbits like to chew stuff up, and I didn't want it to be inside the tractor with the lid closed. Otherwise, they would just chew it up, and I would have another project down the road. Once that was done, man, this thing was complete. So I tested it out, motored it around, patted myself on the back a little bit, and then I turned off the camera for the night. The next day, I made another one of these things. I was using some different materials, and if you're interested, you can catch that video down the road. Alright folks, that does it for this video. Thanks for stopping in and checking it out. And if you found this video entertaining or helpful or good information, throw me a thumbs up. Let me know I'm doing good work here. If you'd like to see more videos like this one or check out any projects I'm doing, hit that subscribe button, and that way you'll know when new stuff comes out. And if anything, I hope this video put a new tool in your toolbox. Y'all take care.